Mamedyarov scored a swift and brutal victory yesterday. Let's see how he got on today. My round 4 play of the day from the FIDE London Grand Prix is his game against Alexander Grischuk. Grischuk has the white pieces here, Mamedyarov with the black pieces. So we have a very normal Spanish type position where white has established these two centre pawns and black has a strong point on e5, and a normal move here for black would be bishop b7, just to maintain the strong point on e5, but also sometimes to threaten here with pressure on the e4 pawn. For example, if white were to play this standard maneuver, bringing the knight to g3, it's not very good in this position, because here knight b4 would threaten the bishop, threaten to win knight for bishop, and also threaten the e4 pawn, so knight f1 would be a poor move. So this would be a very standard move, and then perhaps d5, and well, we'd have a typical Spanish position, rather closed, a lot of manoeuvring, and white has a space advantage, but very somehow a very balanced position. Both sides have chances there. That would be the steady, traditional way to play. But it's very interesting. Mamedyarov must have been fired up after yesterday's win, and he played a very provocative idea. He gave up his strong point on e5. If you remember yesterday, Giri also gave up his centre and paid the price very quickly. Now, this isn't quite as risky, of course Mamedyarov has already castled, but still this is a very provocative way of playing, because you're giving white these two centre pawns. Let's see how this works out. So, okay, why has he done this? Well, he's putting pressure on these pawns. So already you can see that there's a threat to play knight takes d4. And if white were to play, for instance, knight f1, then black takes. Well, if queen takes, then you can take on d4 with a knight. So white would have to play g takes f3, and already this is very unbalanced, of course, because the king isn't as secure here. So Grischuk played h3. Now, if bishop takes knight, of course, knight takes bishop, and the centre is absolutely secure. White has the two bishops. Very nice position indeed. So, of course, Mamedyarov retreated with bishop to h5. Again, knight f1 would, well, not exactly fail, but knight f1 would be met by bishop takes f3. So now Grischuk played very sharply indeed. He was up for the challenge. He played g4. You could play knight b3 here, but now we can see another way in which black can gain counterplay. First of all, you're threatening knight takes bishop, so the bishop has to retreat, and now c5, and again you break up those two centre pawns, and black has counterplay here. So let's just go back. So Grischuk played g4, so he's up for the challenge. So you can see how provocative Mamedyarov's play is, that he's almost forced Grischuk to play very actively indeed in order to hold his centre. But of course there are pros and cons to this move g4. The disadvantage, of course, is that if things go wrong, then the king, of course, can be very exposed. Okay, let's see how Grischuk dealt with the position. Okay, he played a3. Well, this is a very good move. This is all about maintaining the centre. Normally I hate little poor moves at the side of the board like this, but this is all about preventing knight b4 and then c5, breaking up the pawn duo. So that's a good move. It's about containment. Okay, another very provocative move from Mamedyarov. He played h5 here. He could play h6, but after, say, b3 and bishop b2, then I think white is beginning to get control over the position. So Mamedyarov kept stirring things up. He played h5. That really forces white to push on. The knight came back to h7. well, it's a pretty horrible square for the knight, but let's see how things develop. Okay, knight f1. Okay, swinging the knight round in this very standard way to g3, possibly to look at h5, possibly to look at f5. Queen d7 threatening the pawn on h3, and king g2 to defend the pawn. And now d5. Well, I understand why Mamedyarov wants to break up these pawns. I think, he needs to do something very quickly. Let's see how this works out. e5, of course, and we get a very typical position for the Spanish. In fact, it looks like one of these open Spanish positions, where white has this pawn majority on the king side. It's a bit ragged at the moment, and black has a pawn majority on the other side of the board, but of course there are also serious weaknesses on the c-file. But it depends. Can white force through his kingside pawn majority, or can black get counterplay with, say, knight d8 and c5? Let's see how the game develops. This is very, very double-edged and depends on very precise moves from both players. Okay, g6. Now, one of Mamedyarov's problems is that his pieces, for the moment, in particular the knight on h7, are very poorly placed, and I think this is what hampers him in this game. But let's see, knight d8. Okay, this is very sharp indeed. Rook c1, good move. So this kind of pegs black back for the moment. So white is developing nicely on the king side. And now if knight e6, this is the move that black would love to play and get counterplay really quickly with c5. And once he gets that in, then the king is exposed. The problem is white then has queen c6. So, well, with complete control on the c-file. So black has zero counterplay. You can see this knight needs to be round on e7, but hasn't a hope of getting to a decent square. So black has to just wait for the moment with c6. Okay, knight h4 and knight e6. Oh, if king g7 instead, then white arrives first with his attack. I mean, this is absolutely brutal. f5, and black is getting completely blown away here. So okay, knight e6. Now, I think what Mamedyarov was hoping for was that after f4, then c5, and black is just in time with his counterplay. For example, takes d4, and black is blasting through the centre of the board, and now you'll see that white's king is a problem. It's exposed, and black has counterplay here and through the middle and on the long diagonal. That's what Mamedyarov was hoping for, but instead Grischuk seized the moment. He played knight takes g6, an excellent move. Okay, it's a piece sacrifice, but white has already two pawns. Knight g7 played. There are alternatives, but this is probably the best defence. And now, instead of knight takes h5, the obvious move, then queen f5, and I think this might still be good for white, but I think black has a chance of establishing a blockade. But instead of that, Grischuk played very accurately. Queen h6. The threat is g6, for example. There are many threats here. So black is forced to play knight f5, queen takes, and this is a much better version. And now here, well, basically you're going to break the blockade and the pawn is coming down the board. Mamedyarov tried knight takes g3 and tried to organise himself with bishop g7, but these are very simple moves for white to play. Basically you're just establishing control over f5, and then you're going to ram the f-pawn down the board. This endgame would be absolutely hopeless. I mean, these moves are very, very simple for white to play. Mamedyarov tried knight f8, but then came f4. Now he's looking for counterplay. Unless he finds counterplay, he's just completely and utterly lost here with no counterplay whatsoever. So Mamedyarov tried this, but this is also hopeless. Now what's the score? White is 4 pawns up here. Mamedyarov's idea was to sacrifice back, but this was completely hopeless. White's king actually stands very well here, supporting these pawns. And this is also a strong passed pawn, and Grischuk won this game very easily. I know it's equal pawns now, but this c-pawn is far too dangerous, and in fact this was a very, very simple win. The rook just mopped up the pawns here. I may as well just go to the very end just to see the technique, but it is very, very simple. And the rook comes behind the pawn, and here Mamedyarov resigned. White takes here, and then this is a very simple, standard theoretical win. The king hides here, and you slowly push the pawns down the board. It's a really simple win. So there we go. Mamedyarov chanced his arm today with a rather risky strategy. Today his luck wasn't in. So there we go. At the moment, Gelfand won today, and he leads with 3 out of 4. Grischuk is a half point behind with 2.5, and Leko also has 2.5 points. Exciting chess to come. Thanks very much for watching.